Thank you for the occasion, Nahid, that allows us to spend some conversational, kind of in a more intimate conversation, something about Persian classical music, national music, traditional music. There are all kinds of names for it. Musiqi sunnati. And with a great performer and a great scholar of Persian music, as we witnessed before lunch, I think perhaps the first question that comes to my mind with reference to Persian music is that how this tradition of music has in the over the past 150 years or 200 years has evolved. We have this concept of Dastgah, some of us more familiar from the 1950s, 60s, and so on. And then the concept of Radif, that also was introduced, at least to my recollection, slightly later. And the differentiation between the Dastgah and Radif, somewhat perhaps in the minds of many people, including myself, is not very clear. Perhaps it would be a good starting point if you would say a few words about the differentiation between, the distinction between the two.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. I should tell that I have been preoccupied with this subject in the past few years. And I actually tried to look at the early development of the Dastgah system. The term Dastgah goes back to the mid 18th century. I wasn't able to find any reference to that prior to that time. And we know that up to the end of the Safavid period, which means 1720, 30, the modal system of Persian music was based on maqam and shu'beh, which was very much similar to what we have in Persian music right now. But toward the middle of the 18th century, we know that the situation in Iran was very chaotic in a sense. The Afghans invaded, and the Safavid, empire lost its centrality, and as a result of that, a lot of court musicians actually left the court, and they moved to other cities, and that core musical center, court music, was no longer in Iran, and during the Afghan and Afshar period, we don't see much of a court, tradition. Nader Shah, for example, had a lot of musicians in his camp, but there's no evidence that he had, any of those Safavid court musicians. Anyhow, and then we see that the term maqam gradually is replaced by awaz. So a lot of people would call these maqams, awaz, toward the end of the 18th century. Mm-hmm. So there were different awazes, and each had a proper name, and some of them were, a loose version of Safavid maqam. Some of them were new derived melody types. folk drive melody types. Some of them were compositions, and modes from neighboring traditions. So I think that again in the beginning of the 19th century, this musical figure at the court of Fatali Shah put certain awazes together and made these dastgahs. Okay, and he came up with 12 sequences of dastgahs. That it's not that they follow the same structure, the same formula. No, the modal behavior in each dastgah is different. And a lot of people, especially later music theorists, would say that it's a matter of taste how to put these awazes together.
Correct.
And yeah. So he came up with these 12 dastgahs, but I should tell you that the 12 dastgahs that he came up with were completely different from those that we see in the Radif, in Mirza Abdullah's Radif. There were other traditions at the same time. We know that Muhammad Sadiq Khan had a completely different arrangement of dastgahs in that time. He even had some dastgahs that were not really called dastgah in the Radif of Mirza Abdullah, in the repertoire of Mirza Abdullah. So there were different traditions.
Just for the sake of clarity, the Dastgah system of Mirza Abdullah was much later. It was almost late 19th century, am I right? Early 20th century.
Mirza Abdullah and Muhammad Sadiq Khan, these two court musical figures were contemporary. They lived at the same time, and they followed two different traditions.
Correct.
Yeah.
So, of course, even nowadays, of the 12, 7 of them are usually called Dastgah.
Yes.
Another 5 were called Avaz,
That's
such as
right.
Dashti and
That's
Afshari
right.
and so. So, where does Radif fits into this?
Well, to the best of my knowledge, the term Radif starts with Mirza Abdullah. There is no reference to this term prior to Mirza Abdullah, so I think that it was coined by him.
Mm-hmm. Is it?
And
yes,
yeah,
go ahead.
Go ahead.
Is this some kind of an emphasis on the idea that how this gusheh should be played within a dastgah? Is that what Radif is all about?
Yes, yes. Well, first of all, I should tell you that it's not that everyone in the 19th century played the same. There was no common music repertoire which was shared by all musicians. No, that was not the case. Everybody tried to collect his own pieces and put them together and make his own repertoire. And they inherited, some part of this repertoire from their, ancestors.
Isfahan, for instance.
Yes. And at the same time, they were very defensive and secretive about this knowledge. They wouldn't, give it to other people. And
it was, socially speaking, it was always within a family.
It was always within the family. And the Radif was something that Mirza Abdullah inherited from his father and his cousin, yes. And this repertoire, we know that was in their family at least for 2 generations.
And that's what is really standardized. That's
Yes.
what we today
Yes.
recognize as
Yes.
the 12 Dastgah.
The 12 Dastgah. Radif basically means repertoire.
I see.
And the genius of the Radif of Mirza Abdullah was the plucking system that he probably inherited from his father.
I
Yeah.
see. But how far the idea of the gusheh goes back?
The idea of the gusheh actually goes back to the late 16th century.
Really?
Yes,
Mm-hmm.
late 16th century. There's a music theorist in Herat in the 1680 who was at the court of Ali Qoli Khan Shamlu, who was Lale of Abbas Mirza. Yes. And in his musical treatise, he says that the term gusheh originated in Fars and Iraq Ajam, in those regions. Yeah.
Okay, so we, of course, some people would say that's not even standardized either. Because some people say that in the current system there are, 188 gushehs.
That's
some
right.
would say it's more, some
That's
would say
right.
it's yes. It's a matter of interpretation.
It's a matter of interpretation, and it's a matter of musical knowledge. I've heard people saying that, he had a very limited radif. That means his repertoire, the number of gushehs in his repertoire is very limited. Yeah. But Mirza Abdullah obviously collected all the melody types that were known to him at that time, and he came up with this, repository of gushehs.
Yes. Before we go any further and actually focus more on the instruments and your performance, perhaps one more question that is always in my mind. There is all this treatise, there is all this attention to the actual theory of music at the same time as
That's
well.
right.
All this, since Farabi's time, were always written. Right? How come that no notation system was ever developed in Iran, or any attempt was made to shift from this kind of heart-to-heart memorization of the music to some kind of a notation?
Well,
What's your idea on that?
There was a musical notation in the 14th and 15th century, but the
Yes.
purpose of notation was obviously different. It was not for educational purposes. And they just wanted to record, a melodic figure, for example, or, a very short, piece of music. They believed that music has to be transmitted orally.
Yes.
Yeah,
Because that
and
is
there
a
was
Sufi idea.
yes, and there were certain ideas and certain discourses around music that was also transmitted through, teacher and pupil.
Mm-hmm. Which, as I would imagine, it's a very kind of a Sufi idea that
In a
once
sense,
you are
yes.
in the environment of the Khanegah,
Yes.
that's the master-pupil kind of relationship that requires the kind of presence
That's right. That's
rather than reading from the notations.
That's right. And one more thing that I want to add to your last question is that why Mirza Abdullah came up with this idea of radif. He was a pedagogue, in essence. And as opposed to his other colleagues who were improvisers, who were just performers, he was not a high-caliber musician, Mirza Abdullah. And he had a very limited technique of tar. In her memoir, Taj al-Sultanah would say that, I was supposed to study with Mirza Abdullah. He came and taught me for a few sessions. And after 1 or 2 years, I could play the tar better than this, gentleman. That's what she says. Anyhow, he was not a very, professional musician. He was a professional musician, but he didn't have that virtuoso. Yeah. So he came up with this radif, and he had to fix this, gushehs. He had to come up with a fixed version of these melodies in order to be able to teach it to his students. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been able to do it. You can't teach something to your student and next time you change it. You have to have a frozen, a fixed, version of your melodies to be able to do it. So this is what happened.
Which one would assume came about at the time when music comes out of the private space into an environment where there would be pupils who would like to actually learn music.
That's right.
In a more standardized fashion.
Exactly. Prior to him, music was not really accessible to everybody.
Yes.
I said, people, these, top musicians at the court were very secretive and protective of their own repertoire. They wouldn't
this
have.
Is what, late 19th century constitutional revolution,
yes,
post-constitutional period. That's one of the outcomes of the constitutional revolution that opens up the space for the music. Now, going back a little bit more towards your towards the instruments and the history of instruments, I suppose Mirza Abdullah's main instrument was Sitar, wasn't it?
His main instrument was
Sitar. Although the history of Sitar goes back a long time, and it's kind of a very central to the ensemble Persian music, and yet at the same time very private and intimate instrument. Right. Can you tell us a little bit more about it?
Well, this long-necked lute has been known in Iran for many centuries, and the generic term for this instrument is tambour. Sometimes it had 2 strings, sometimes it had 3 strings, and sometimes it had 4 strings. And sometimes the instrument becomes known by the number of strings that it has. For example, a dutar is obviously a tambour which has 2 strings, or setar is a type of tambour which has only 3 strings. So this,
although a 4th one was added to it by Mushtaq.
That's right. That's right.
Yes, it was a great Sufi of the early 19th century.
But they kept the name
Setar. Yes. Okay. So, would you like to tell us, going back to the idea of a Dastgah, I presume the most significant indicator of any Dastgah is the daramad, isn't it?
That's right.
Can you tell us more about that and play something for us to see how a daramad is really played?
Yes. Daramad is the opening piece of each Dastgah. And in a sense, a person who starts a Dastgah always has to start with a daramad, in which you introduce the first mode in each Dastgah, and you start to unfold it, little by little throughout the daramad, and elaborate upon melodic elements of the daramad. And once the daramad, which is by itself an avaz, is fully developed and fully unfolded, then you modulate to a next avaz. And once you elaborate on the next avaz, and then you can modulate on the third avaz. So in a sense,
here you mean gusheh, or do you mean?
No, avaz is a larger segment.
I see.
And within the avaz, you have 3 or 4 or 5 gushes. Okay? For example, in the first avaz, which is always called daramad,
which Dastgah are you playing?
I'm going to play mahur. And then the next gusheh, kereshme. This gusheh is set to a line of poetry. هزار و مرتبه به به از آن لب شکرینت. So as you see, I played the daramad first, and then I started to develop within the melodic confines of the daramad by playing the kereshme. This is one of the ways that you can always develop a gusheh, playing a kereshme in it. As a matter of fact, if you go throughout the Radif of Mirza Abdullah, you see kereshme in many instances. Okay.
Always in Mahur?
No.
Or it can be other.
It can be anywhere. It can be anywhere. So I'm saying that kereshme is usually played just to elaborate upon the melodic elements of a gusheh. This is how gusheh is melodically developed.
Can I make your job a little bit difficult and ask you to play kereshme in another Dastgah?
Yes, I play. This is shur. Once you finish the daramad, then you can play the kereshme. So, let's go back to Mahur. Once you finish the first avaz, the second avaz is a modulation. So you modulate to another avaz. In the second avaz, the tonal center is different. So the tonic in the first avaz was do, whereas in the second avaz is re. The tonic was C, here is D. Within this avaz, you can play a series of gushes. Even at kereshme. Now, the third avaz is khavaran. The tonic center is different, you see? And you can also play the kereshme here. And you usually go back to the first avaz to punctuate different segments of the Dastgah.
This is the fruit?
Yes, fruit. Iraq. So now I am going to play the Kereshme again. Furud again to Mahur. And the concept of Dastgah is completed when you play a tasnif and a ring at the end of these awazes. So in a sense, Dastgah was a concert format, which started with daramad and series of awazes, and at last a tasnif and ring were performed. This complete format was called Dastgah all the time. But in the 20th century, all these segments were referred to as gusheh. Okay. There are still some, master musicians who try to mark, certain sections as avaz and certain, pieces as gusheh. But ordinary musicians, just call everything gusheh. And sometimes, daramad is called the Dastgah, which is not correct. The whole structure, the whole ordered structure is called Dastgah.
Can you give us also an example? Because it is, first of all, tell us a little bit about what the murakkab khani and murakkab navazi is. When you move from one Dastgah to another Dastgah, and there is of course a special skill associated with it, where you are moving from where to the other.
That's right.
And how that it's done.
Well, murakkab khani or murakkab navazi is when you modulate to a distant avaz or distant Dastgah. Even murakkab means modulation. You have a modulatory scheme. Mm-hmm. It's called murakkab. And Dastgah itself is a murakkab, but in the Dastgah structure, you always modulate to near, awazes. But once you modulate to distant awazes, then it requires a very complicated technique that you have to, develop. It's not something that you can do it, on your own. It takes a lot of practice and, So, murakkab navazi, in a sense, is modulation from one Dastgah to another, and maybe you have a series of Dastgahs, and you can modulate from one to another. This is called murakkab.
Great. As I recall, Delkash is usually the entry from Mahur to Shur.
That's right.
Which is part of this murakkab.
That's right.
Can you play a little bit of that from first?
add that in the school of Mirza Abdullah, Murakkab Khani to Murakkab in a sense that you modulate from one Dastgah to another Dastgah is not acceptable, because they would say that if a musician modulates from one Dastgah to another, that means that his repertoire of gushes in one Dastgah was limited, so he had to move to another Dastgah. But once you know the whole structure of the Dastgah and all the gushes, then you try to modulate within the Dastgah rather than, modulating to another Dastgah.
Which I presume at our time considered as the height of musical skill
That's
and
right.
the musical knowledge to
That's
be able to move from one to the other, and not only from one Dastgah to another, but several Dastgahs. Because I recall Shajarian's, for instance, famous piece on Nawa, which
That's
he
right.
moves from 4 or 5
That's a
Dastgahs.
masterpiece. That's a
Yes,
masterpiece.
that's the
It's
way.
not that anyone can do such a thing.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, is this, how much time do we have?
I would say about perhaps 10 more minutes.
Okay, but then of course we hear about, you pointed out the reng and the tasnif.
That's right.
But something which is very popular, at least in the 20th century, is this Chahar mezrab, which becomes very much part of this repertoire.
That's right.
In each Dastgah,
That's right.
or for instance, Masnavi becomes part of the repertoire. How these were introduced and how much they have, are these in order to give it greater variety to the music that you play? Or?
Yeah. Well, Chahar mezrab was basically a composition which was developed on the santur.
Oh, really? Mm.
Yes. And I have to tell you that musicians of different musical instruments had different repertoires in the Qajar period, in the 19th century. Chahar mezrab was one of the specialities of santur players. When we look at the Chahar mezrabs that were played on the Setar, Chahar mezrab, 4 mezrab. Dum, dum, da, da, da. 1, 2, 3, 4. This is an early Chahar mezrab, which was played, this is a Chahar mezrab in Radif Mirza Abdullah. But later on, in the hands of Darvish Khan and Abul Hassan Sabah, Chahar mezrab developed and became a very sophisticated musical compositions. The famous Chahar mezrab composed by Darvish Khan is in Chahar mezrab, you have a section which is called ritornello in English, which serves as a point of reference. You compose around this section. You move to different, areas of melodic range, and ultimately you come back and punctuate, different sections of Chahar mezrab with this particular section, which was called in the 19th century Parvane, but it's not common anymore to
Parvanena is another gusheh in Shur, isn't it? Gerayani, they play Parvanena, am I right?
In Rospanjgah, Parvanena.
In Rospanjgah.
Yeah.
Okay, now, obviously another important question is the question of improvisation. What you have just described to us seemed to us that there is a set of vases and gushehs.
That's right.
That you have to play. So how does this correspond to improvisation? Because people's improvisation in the West particularly is a kind of a jazz improvisation. I wonder to what extent the improvisation in Persian traditional music is really a very free performance, or is it something that is always subject to certain discipline?
Yes. Well, free improvisation is not really acceptable to traditional musicians. You know, I remember that my own teacher would criticize some improvisers as doing vagabondage on the notes. You know, you play something, but it's so scattered-minded, and you really don't know what you're doing. You know. So in order to be able to improvise, you need to have some melodic ideas. And what are these melodic ideas? You know, each gusheh has certain melodic phrases, characteristic phrases. So you need to know these characteristic phrases to understand what the structure of each gusheh is. And based on those characteristic phrases, then you can play around and come up with your own, you know, creative input, and you know, play with these phrases and you know, improvise upon them. So you need to know the structure of each gusheh first, and based on the structure, then you can add your own, you know, input.
And do you think that this is more of a conscious effort? Or is it something that it's internalized and really comes out of your heart? Or
Well, you know, the thing is that unfortunately people become cliché after a while. So it's not that, you know, every time you play a gusheh, you come up with something completely new, you know. So people usually develop their own, you know, version of each, you know, melody, and most of the time they play it the same. And it's very hard to come up with, you know, new ideas every time that you play music. But sometimes you come across some people who have this, you know, ability, and yeah.
Well, if you have a few more minutes, if people have questions, Afshin, do you have anything to add or to say? Because he's another Setar player sitting there, so I have to ask him what he thinks, or if he has any questions or comments.
You referred to...
1 second. Maybe not.
You referred to modulation as the transition from one melodic pattern to another melodic pattern, typically in the same Dastgah. In Arab music, in the music of the region, the phrases are typically materially shorter for the melodic patterns that they end up playing. And that offers a wider array, a wider vocabulary of transition from place to place to place. There's been arguments, there have been suggestions that in Radif, one of the things that we have done in organizing the gushehs is that by not shortening the gushehs substantially more, so that we're left with only the four, the gam, or the 4 notes or the 5 notes that are relevant, by not doing that, we sort of hamstring the musician in not being able to move fast enough or modulate fast enough from place to place. Do you give any credence to that kind of thinking?
I didn't get what you said. Can you elaborate on that?
Sure. So in the traditions of oud, for example, in Iraqi music and generally in Arab music, the melodic patterns have been reduced substantially more than what we have in gushehs in Iran. So in Iran, when you play gusheh, the examples that you demonstrated, the melodic pattern is substantially longer. It's typically mandated by the rhythm that comes from the poetry that you bring into the piece. In Arab music, typically you don't have that limitation. In the
I know,
tradition,
but the problem is that in Persian music you cannot really reduce the melodic phrases of a gusheh to just their scale, to their own scale. So beside the scale, a gusheh is characterized with certain phrases, and in order to show the real characteristic of a gusheh, you need to play those phrases.
Maybe I'm not clear with my question. I'm suggesting that the gusheh in itself, the melodic pattern in itself, is a hamstring. Is a way of limiting the kinds of things that can be done in the music. So if you were instead to focus on the four notes that constitute a gusheh, shahed, the opening note, the finalis, focus on those and dispense, and I know sacrilegious, I am being shot as I say this, dispense with the gusheh in some sense. Because in some sense, the gusheh was a mnemonic for the student to learn the structure. If the structure is fundamentally something that can be extracted...
But there are different ways of looking at the structure of the gusheh. Of course, some people would look at it as a mnemonic, pattern. Yeah. But for some people, gusheh has a structure, and the whole structure is what makes that gusheh. You cannot reduce it. You cannot, eliminate certain figures. That's what I think. But I might.
My colleague Shirazi salad, Israeli salad. It's the same thing.
Actually, it may be a
You have
good.
to put it together a certain way.
But it may be a good segue to ask this question. Is this, we witnessed in the middle of the 20th century, this kind of a movement toward a more purist kind of music. Perhaps part of it a response to the gusheh, part of it response to the introduction of piano and violin into the Persian music. And all of that, this school with Safat and the others to try to move back to what they consider as purist music. What's your position on that one? Because I think it corresponds to the fact that if there were attempts to try to broaden the range of the Persian music, I don't want to be very technical about it because I don't know, and then try to return to this kind of a supposedly more pure music, Persian music. Where do you stand on that?
Well, I would say that people have always looked at this subject from different perspectives, and there were some people who were very purist, and there were some people who were not, that purist, and they were not really concerned about the showing the structure of a gusheh, and their improvisation was, wider in a sense. Of course, I have my own preference, but I prefer to.
Why you don't want to share it with us? I think there is another question. Did you have a
Perhaps
question?
we have one more question, and then it's time for a quick coffee before we move on to the next session. So between Ida and Anne and Anthony, since Ida has not spoken yet, maybe we'll go to Ida.
Okay, thank you very much. It was really interesting. I enjoyed it very much. My question is very basic. When did traditional Iranian music became traditional?
I guess sometimes in 1970s or yeah, with the establishment of Markaz Hifz Shahe. That was one of the major movements that was behind this, traditional music. Yeah.
So
And the word traditional was something, it was imported, from
Yes.
France. Yeah.
Because I wonder, Mr. Pina would have referred to the music of Golha as traditional.
That's right.
Or
Asil, and he said
Asil.
Asil.
asil. That's the word asil. Yes. But which more or less means the same thing. Don't you think? Yes. Asil is also is an attempt to try to purify music from what it was referred as mubtazal.
Yeah.
This kind of trivial music now it has been purified.
You basically use this term when you think that what you have is in danger,
Yeah, I mean, he was very concerned about all the influences from
Yeah.
Indian and Arabic and Turkish music that were overtaking, and that the Persianness of the music was becoming very Kamran.
Yes. Wonderful. Thank you so much. I
Thank
think
you so
we are
much.
at the end of our time.
Yes, we have coffee, just one on the ground floor, and then we meet back here again at 4:15. Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Pourjavady.
I want you to play a piece for us. I forgot we didn't have time.
I think we can do that. Is that
Is that okay if you can play a piece for us? It's still in Mahmoud, yes?
No, I changed it.
I'm not wrong, this was Isfahan, wasn't it?
Yes, yes.
Great.